Here is no more incredible feeling than sitting in the woods while the wind kisses your face, tracing your fingers softly over the plush carpet of moss. I'd never been happier during those first few moments in my new home. I wanted to connect to nature, and here I was doing it. The shade from trees stretched across the ground and dotted my legs with bits of sunshine that crept through the leaves. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, savoring the musky smell of earth below me and the sound of the river flowing between the algae-covered rocks. Heaven was those first few moments at home. I reluctantly dragged myself away from it all to go back inside and start unpacking my things. It was late in the day, so I was more focused on the essentials than anything: coffee maker, blankets, toiletries. The deal was finalized that morning, and I was too excited to wait another day to move in. So, I said goodbye to my closet of an apartment in Brookdale and booked it all the way here. Chapter 1. Lottie. Remy, my 9-year-old rescue lab, was more than happy about the upgrade in space. I had no neighbors nearby, so he could run off leash wherever he wanted in the woods. Seeing all the space he had to play, he had a new lease on life. My friends all thought I was crazy for buying a house before getting married. They didn't understand why I'd risk my future partner not liking it. I'd been alive for 25 years, and no one had even taken an interest in me, so why should I wait around for marriage? I'm independent and don't need anyone to make me comfortable. If I'm happy, then that's all that matters to me. I just couldn't explain to them why I felt so compelled to move here, in any case. I'd often searched online for houses in my spare time. Something clicked in me when I saw this house, and I knew I had to have it. Luckily, it was affordable, and the owners were eager to sell. Was I worried something horrible had happened in the house causing the owners to want to leave? Extremely worried. But in this housing market, who can afford to be that picky? Besides, I'm a Pisces, so I've always been very sensitive to energy. I knew it wasn't haunted when I took my first tour. Even with that comfort, I couldn't help wondering why I was able to get such a good deal on the place. After unpacking the essentials, I walked to the front door and called for Remy. He was an old dog, so I trusted he wouldn't wander too far off alone. But when he didn't come back right away, I got worried. I grabbed a bag of his treats and walked outside, shaking it to get his attention. Remy, I yelled through the woods, hoping to hear his collar's name tags jingling any second. The only answer I got was silence in the woods. I shuddered at the eerie quiet, instinctively knowing that silent woods weren't a good sign. No birds were chirping, the wind was no longer singing in the air, and no bugs chimed as the night grew closer. I stepped out into the grass and called for Remy again. My stomach churned with every step I took into the woods. I shook his treats and whistled for him. Living in a city like Brookdale had me ill-prepared for situations like this. Remy was always on a leash, and if anything happened, heaven forbid, there were a dozen animal shelters nearby and community apps to get the word out. Now, it was just me walking through the woods at dusk all alone. As happy as I was to be there, I was starting to understand my friends' hesitations. An old, narrow trail led from my back porch into the woods, so I followed it. It looked like a natural foot trail the previous owners must have made years ago. Over time, nature started reclaiming the beaten grass and dirt when they stopped using it. They were an older couple, so I imagined hiking wasn't as easy for them as it had once been. I tried to be as quiet as possible to keep an ear out for any sign of Remy. Thankfully, I heard a subtle metal clinking in the woods to my left, so I stepped away from the trail and followed it. The closer I got, the more worried I grew for my dog. His voice had a subtle whimper, and I worried he'd been hurt during his outing. Remy, I frantically yelled for him. I stepped out of a dense patch of woods and stood before a flowing river. It was much wider than the part which flowed near my house, and the murky brown water flowed much faster. Remy's whimpering drew my attention, and I whipped my head around to see him. He quickly walked up to me. His gait was off as if he might have fallen and injured one of his paws. "Come here, boy," I said as I knelt and patted my legs to call him towards me. He ran to me quickly, his whimpering with every step broke my heart. He jumped up on me and licked my face, clearly very happy to see me. Before turning to walk back to the house, I took a quick look at his leg to see what was causing his limp. Thankfully, all it was a small thorn in his paw. I quickly pulled it out, racking my brain to remember where I packed my first aid equipment. The thorn wasn't deep in the pad, but I would feel a lot better if I put some ointment on it. When I started walking back to the house with Remy, the sun had fallen entirely. I took a deep breath to keep myself from panicking. It was dark, and I had been in such a rush to find Remy that I didn't keep a close eye on my surroundings on the way there. I had a general idea of how to return, but I was worried I'd get turned around. I walked alongside the river for a minute, knowing I could follow it for direction until it brought me closer to the stream by my house. As I walked for a moment, I heard quiet splashing in the water. It sounded like someone was wading upstream against the current. Something in me told me to run away. Whoever or whatever was in the water wasn't my concern, and I didn't want to get on the wrong side of it. But before I could turn and make my beeline into the woods, a woman rose from the murky brown water. Her long black hair draped down her back and flowed behind her while she stood. She was facing away from me, but I could just make out a muffled humming over the fast-running water. She was wading to the other side, and I thought I could sneak away before she saw me. She looked harmless, but I was more worried about coming across as a creep than anything. Remy stopped moving and lowered his arms defensively. I tried to drag him away quietly, but his low growl turned into a fierce bark. The woman slowly turned around to face me. Something about her calmness rubbed me the wrong way, but I tried not to focus on it so I could get out as quickly as possible. She faced me with an unbothered, placid face while Remy continued barking. Her soaking wet hair clung to her face and cascaded down the front of her body, thankfully covering her chest. The moonlight turned her skin a sickly gray, and shadows obscured the contours of her face. "I'm so sorry," I offered after a moment, still trying to pull Remy back into the brush. "He never acts like this. I don't know what's gotten into him. I didn't mean to scare you." The woman's only response was a slow look from me to Remy. Her eyes met his, and after a moment, his barking stopped, and he slipped out of my hands and started making his way through the trees again, eager to be away from her. I can't say I blamed him, either. She raised her eyes back to me, and I flashed an awkward smile and backed away from her. The water rippled around her, and I realized she was slowly making her way out of the water. "I guess we'll be on our way then," I informed her. I quickly turned around, feeling my heart throbbing in my throat. Something about this situation was wrong, and my body was in fight-or-flight mode. All I wanted to do was return to my house and lock all my doors and windows. Before I could step back into the woods, I heard the slapping of her wet feet on the muddy rocks behind me. Curiosity took over, and I looked over my shoulder one last time. There was no woman behind me. Whatever was in the water was something else entirely. She was several feet taller than me and towered over me. Her back was arched downward, and I could see her arms were long and disfigured. One reached from her shoulders to the ground, and the other, while slightly shorter, was much thicker and textured like bark. Moments before, she appeared as a small woman bathing in the river, and then she was a gigantic monstrosity. Flight mode kicked in, and I started to dash away from her. Unfortunately for me, she was quicker than she looked. Before I knew it, she wrapped her arms tightly around me. I could just barely make out whimpers from Remy over the shrieking sound she made right in my ear. My ears were ringing. I could hardly breathe, thanks to her tight grip. I frantically looked around for something to help me but had no luck. My body slammed into the ground as she threw me down. Despite being in excruciating pain, I was thankful for the gasp of fresh air I could finally take. Every breath brought more pain as my chest burned. I tried to calm myself to keep from hyperventilating, but I couldn't when I saw the woman's face. All the feminine features on her face had vanished. Looking down at me, with eyes as dark and cold as a black hole, was a monster whose mouth hung open to reveal two sets of razor-sharp teeth. The creature pinned me to the ground and looked to the sky, shrieking. Her head whipped back down to mine, and she growled. Her eyes were dark, yet I could see the hunger within them. Would this be how I die? My eyes slowly opened. The groggy haze of early evening was fresh in my vision. A lathe softly shoved my shoulders to shake me awake. I'd never been much of a morning person, even though mornings for us started at dusk. "I'm awake," I muttered to her to stop the shaking. All our lives, she'd been the impatient one. We're twins, but we couldn't be more different from each other. Elaith was punctual and organized, she was diplomatic and fair. On the other hand, I was none of those things, and she never let me forget it. "Perhaps you should sit up, then," she suggested. Her tone was rushed, and I could tell she was annoyed with me already. "I don't want to be late again because of you." I rolled my eyes and sat up, shaking the covers of my bedroll off. The lights in the treehouse were dim, but I could see she'd already set aside all our equipment for our watch, and a bowl of oats waited for me on the stovetop. M. Chapter 2. Errol. Hurry up and get dressed so we can leave, she demanded. Yes, ma'am, I mumbled as I stood from the ground and made my way to the food. Elaith moved around the house and finished grabbing the few things she thought we might need during our outing. She was an overthinker. I knew that more than half of what she was bringing wasn't necessary, but I also knew there was no point telling her that. We're only going to be gone for 2 days, I joked when I saw the amount of food she was packing in her tin. But what if we're trapped somewhere? Or if there's a bad storm and we can't get back? Or if we... None of that is going to happen. We've done this route dozens of times, and nothing has happened, I interrupted, casually trying to reassure her so she would stop worrying. You're overthinking all of this. It doesn't hurt to be prepared, you know, she defensively replied. And I only overthink because... I underthink. She looked at me and sighed as I finished her sentence. I'd heard that little phrase of hers my entire life, and I knew exactly where she was going. She shook her head while I laughed and finished eating my breakfast. Get dressed, she yelled over her shoulder as she walked out of the treehouse. I obeyed her orders and quickly changed into comfortable trousers and a loose-fitting shirt. Elaith preferred me to wear clothes with the Guardian's emblem on them, but I never cared much for the uniforms. Besides, my bow should be enough evidence of who I am. Hello gorgeous, I whispered to my bow as I took it off the wall. Its name was Oak, and it was my pride and joy. There was no bow in the realm quite like it. In fact, the humans ceased to use bows centuries ago. Oak was sturdy, with an easy-to-handle light body covered in engravings and runes from the folk who carried it before me. I strapped Oak and a quiver of arrows to my back and left the treehouse to find Elaith. The sun had set by the time I left, but the hazel woods came to life at night. Moonlight shone through the canopy of trees, and lightning bugs danced in the air, the light from their tiny bodies flickering as they moved. The small village had a peaceful bustle as everyone started their day. Small creatures climbed from their homes inside the trees, and the elven folk, including Elaith and myself, climbed down from our treehouses. A few folks looked at me and gave me a nod of approval as I made my way to the village entrance. Though guardians were far and few between, we were a powerful few. Elaith stood proud against a tree, waiting for me to arrive. She wore her uniform with pride and carried a long sword at her side. Sometimes when I looked at her, I felt like I saw myself from another universe. Our faces were identical, despite the gender difference, and our hair was the same raven black. As children, we were indistinguishable except for our eyes. Elaith's were a vibrant mossy green, and I shared that color in one of my eyes. The other was a dark blue, not unlike the twilight sky. She was tall with a rigid posture and petite frame, her uniform fitting loosely and her hair always neatly tied. I'm slightly taller with a muscular build. I put less effort into my appearance than she does hers. When I looked at her, all I could see was our father. We shared his likeness, and he raised both of us the same, but somehow she turned out to be a replica of him. He'd be proud of that. I didn't like to wonder what he'd think of me. Ready? Elaith asked me when I approached her. I nodded my head, and we started our journey. The Guardian's job is to patrol the hazel woods and keep the Unseelie in line. When we first came to this realm, they were violent and possessive, trying to claim the land as their own to govern themselves as they did in the Fae realm. While many of us aren't entirely benevolent, the people of this realm are mortal and frail. Our elders couldn't trust the Unseelie not to harm them. They refused to live with us, too. So now, all 5 guardians make regular patrols to ensure they're not doing anything wrong. The patrol path wasn't anything too exciting in and of itself. It was a trail in the woods that led to the river, then we followed the river downstream for a few miles and circled back. The patrol wouldn't take 2 days if we didn't have to walk at a quarter of our usual pace. We do it to keep our eyes peeled for the Unseelie or any other sign that something is wrong. A permanent camp is set up for us at the river. When we arrive, the other 2 guardians return, and we switch every few days. Elaith and I walked silently for the first few hours of our patrol. We had to listen carefully for any signs of trouble. She has always been a stickler for obeying that rule. She was always incredibly nervous walking near the river. Many of the Unseelie trapped here mostly live in the water, consequently, it can be challenging to spot them. Patrols are typically uneventful, but Elaith was always nervous near the water after what happened to our father. Our father was one of the first guardians, and he raised us to join when we came of age. His dream was for his entire family to be righteous protectors of good and innocence, but he was killed before he could see it come true. He was patrolling one night in the winter when it was darker than usual. He was ambushed by a nixie, who pulled him under the water, and he drowned. His partner tried to stop it but couldn't do much underwater. Olathe lived to make him proud and protect the people from the creature that took his life. But sometimes, I wondered if that was really the right way to live. At what point do you stop living for other people? We saw the river campsite and waved at the other two patrols waiting for us. Hagen and Thalin, brothers who lived to make our lives miserable. They got under Olathe's skin more than mine, and they knew it, so they focused their attention on her most of the time. "You're late," Thalin yelled at us as we approached. "Some of us have lives, Errol. You'd be good to remember that," Hagen chimed in, coming up behind his brother and trying to make himself appear intimidating. I opened my mouth to reply, intending to insult them, but Olathe glared at me and spoke over me. "Just leave, both of you. I'm not in the mood for any of your games," she commanded. Thalin stared at her for a moment and laughed to himself. He looked at me with a rotten smile, and I could clearly imagine his thoughts. Olathe is the only woman ever to be a guardian, and they look down on her, and me, for that matter, for listening to her. I knew her ideas and dedication to this role would make her the leader someday. I just wished that they'd respect that too. They pushed past us, bumping into my shoulder on the way. As much as I wanted to chase them down and confront them, I didn't. I couldn't understand why they thought so highly of themselves and had the nerve to treat others so poorly. "Let's set our stuff down," I suggested to Olathe. We walked to the small campsite and unpacked our things to get settled and take a break. I pulled out some jerky from my pack and started nibbling on the tender meat. Kira, the village cook, did a fantastic job seasoning it, and I savored every bite. The wind blew, brushing my already unkempt hair around and covering my eyes, and I caught a whiff of something unusual in the air. It smelled like jasmine flowers, and tea had been baking in the sun. I stood up and inhaled again. Olathe looked at me very confused, but I said nothing to her. Mindlessly I started walking toward the scent. Something about it was familiar, and I had to find it. "Where are you going?" Olathe called after me, hurriedly getting to her feet to follow. I didn't respond. I continued to follow the scent for a moment, and the only thing that dragged me out of my stupor was a loud shriek from somewhere in front of me. I started running towards it, pulling Oak off my shoulder and readying an arrow in the string. After a moment, I saw what made the noise, an Unseelie. As far as I could tell from my poor vantage point, it had a human girl pinned to the ground. I pulled back my arrow and fired my first shot at it. The string hummed as I let the arrow fly, which landed softly on the creature's side. It sat up and looked right at me. I quickly drew another arrow from my quiver and fired it right away. It dodged the shot and quickly stood up. I'd never seen such a tall Unseelie before, and for a brief moment, I considered turning around. But hearing the woman groaning and crying on the ground lit a fire inside me. The Unseelie dashed towards me, and I fired another shot as it did, which landed in its stomach but didn't slow it down. It lunged for me, and I managed to jump out of the way just in time. While it was on the ground, I ran further back so my next shot would have more momentum when it landed. I readied the arrow, hoping it would be the last one I needed, and waited for it to turn around and face me. The creature opened its mouth to shriek, and I sunk the arrow right into it. The shrieking came to a sudden halt, and the tall body collapsed. Olathe, who must have been just moments behind me, showed up after the fact and looked down at the large Unseelie. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before, but she had paid a lot more attention in lessons, so if anyone would recognize it, she would. The woman behind me was crying and whimpering in pain. I quickly turned around and ran over to her. Her head was bleeding, and I could see there was a scratch on her neck bleeding as well. A lot of the Unseelie used poisons and toxins, and unless Olathe knew what this one was, we wouldn't know how to help her. "Olathe!" I yelled to draw my sister's attention to me. "She's hurt, what do I do?" The woman was writhing in pain against the mud, and tears fell from her gray eyes. I gently took her head in my hands to gauge the severity of her injuries. "I'm not going to hurt you, I'm here to help," I whispered to her after she winced in pain when I touched her. "I don't know what that is," Olathe cried out, clearly stressed and disappointed for not knowing something. I nodded my head and carefully lifted the woman into my arms. At the very least, she needed treatment for the wounds. We could carry her back to camp and use some of our medical supplies to help her. I looked down at her in my arms, careful not to jostle her around too much. Her honey blonde hair was stained red with her blood. The scent I'd been chasing of jasmine and green tea was emanating from her. With her in my arms, I immediately knew who she was, and my need to help her grew stronger. She was my mate. Part of me had started to come to terms with death when the woman was on top of me. Her teeth were sharp, and her claws dug into my skin and burned me from the inside out. My entire life replayed in my mind, and I accepted it for what it was. Then all of a sudden, the weight on my chest vanished, and I could breathe again. Every inhale felt like I was being stabbed, but I was grateful for the pain. The man who carried me away was gentle, but every step he took felt like it was breaking my bones. I didn't know where he was taking me, I just tried to hang on to him. Bright white light filled the peripheral of my vision and slowly clouded it until it was all I could see. Suddenly it snapped away, and darkness took over. Moments later, I opened my eyes while being laid down on the ground. I was in front of some makeshift campsite with a small tent and a dwindling campfire. The slight warmth my body absorbed from it felt nice, and I wished I could sit up and stoke the flames for more. I turned my head and watched the man who brought me here rifling through bags, looking for Chapter 3. Lottie. Something. Another person, too blurry to tell who they might be, was searching for something too. They were yelling, and I could see how their arms flailed wildly, even though I could only hear the muffled tones of their voices. Before I knew it, I was back in the man's arms, being carried away from the campsite and deeper into the woods. The white vision returned, and my mind pieced together that it was the pain causing my vision impairment. The next time I opened my eyes, it was daytime, and I was in a bed. My head still throbbed, and my chest ached. I took a deep breath, and the burning had gone away, but I was still tender. I looked around and realized I wasn't in my bed but someone else's. I winced as I slowly sat up and jumped when a hand softly touched my arm. "Careful now," a soft, deep voice said to me. "You don't want to hurt yourself anymore." I looked up and saw the man who had rescued me clearly for the first time. He had dark, wavy black hair that rested just above his shoulders, it was unkempt and combed back with his fingers. His dark pink lips were a sharp contrast against his flawless pale skin. And his eyes were both bright and shimmering, one was blue and the other green. "Where am I?" I mumbled, taking a better look around the room. It was a simple cabin filled with basic furniture that looked handmade. Behind the man was another person who looked like him, though she was thinner and had long, flowing hair. She was pacing back and forth, looking between me and the floor. "You're in our house in the Hazelwoods," he answered in a calm, low voice. "My name is Errol, and that's my sister Elaith." When he introduced Elaith, he turned his head towards her, and I saw his ears for the first time. Everything about him seemed normal, aside from his ears. They were long and pointed at an angle behind him. Elaith had them too. My hands moved towards them before I could tell myself to resist the urge to touch them and see if they were real. Errol gently moved my hand away after I pulled on the point. It felt real, and by the look on his face, I had done something weird. In hindsight, touching a stranger's ears like that is probably rude. "I'm sure you've got a lot of questions, and I intend to answer them," he offered me with a smile, setting my hand down in my lap. "For starters, yes, my ears are real. And no, I am not human." I stared at him momentarily, unsure what to say to that information. I did have questions, dozens of them, but I didn't know where to begin. "What are you then?" I managed to ask. "We're Fae. Specifically, my sister and I are Elven. But there are other races as well," he answered while I nodded. All of this was a dream, right? I'd fallen asleep outside in the sun, and the heat was driving me crazy. Any minute now, I'd wake up and go inside to finish unpacking. "Where's Remy?" I asked suddenly, the memory of why I was in the woods, to begin with, coming to the front of my mind. "Who?" he asked. "We only saw you by the river." "Oh no," I sighed and stood up from the bed. My heart dropped in my chest, and I started looking around for the door. "You really should take it easy," Errol said as he walked toward me and gently took my hand to lead me back. "You almost died last night, you need to rest." "But Remy could still be out there, I can't let him get hurt by that thing," I pled. "What does he look like?" Elaith chimed in, walking to me with her arms crossed, her face pinched into an annoyed grimace. "He's my dog, he's about 30 pounds and black with some white speckles on his fur," I replied. She looked at Errol, and he shrugged his shoulders. I could tell they were communicating without saying a word to each other. Elaith sighed and turned away from me, grabbing a pack and attaching a sword to her belt before storming out of the room. She's going to go make sure he's okay, Errol said, and I exhaled a sigh of relief. Do you remember what happened? Sort of, I replied, pinching my nose and squeezing my eyes shut to push past the throbbing headache. I just found Remy by the river, and this woman was bathing. I tried to get away, but she walked out and attacked me. I mean, I guess it wasn't really a she. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't human at all, that's correct. It's one of the Fae, Errol said, and I stared at him with a confused look. Didn't he just say he's Fae? Don't worry, I won't hurt you. There are good and bad Fae, just like there are good and bad humans. In fact, I was out there to protect people like you from creatures like that. So, what was that, and why did it attack me? It's a long story, and I'm happy to tell you if you're feeling all right enough for it, he said, staring at me as if he were trying to evaluate me. I'm fine, I lied. My head ached, and my entire body hurt, but I didn't see why that should keep me from listening to a story. Okay, then, a little over 100 years ago, there was a war on our realm. Your realm? I asked, wrinkling my brow. Yes, the Fae realm, he answered before continuing his story. There was a war between the Fae and the Unseelie Fae. The Unseelie, one of which attacked you, an evil Fae that only wants to cause harm and control the people around them. The war was volatile and catastrophic for both sides. Fae have always been in the mortal realm, but during the war, all of our portals were shut off, and we've been trapped here ever since. If there are so many Fae here, why haven't I seen any of you before? I asked him, unsure if I fully believed what he was saying. You probably have, actually. We can glamour ourselves to appear more human, he laughed before turning his head to the side to show me his ears. The point suddenly faded away, and a soft round ear, not unlike mine, sat in place of it. I reached my hand to it again, and Errol laughed, letting me touch it this time. I could still feel the point but not see it. How did you do that? I asked him, completely dumbfounded. Would you believe me if I said it was magic? I stared at him in awe for a moment. The sharp and impossibly beautiful face I'd been staring at while he told the story had shifted. Now it was a soft round face with two dull grey eyes and a stubble beard. I hadn't realized how inhuman he looked before. His face gradually reappeared, and my jaw hung open watching it. That's incredible, I whispered, and he laughed. His eyes lit up as he smiled. Tearing my eyes away from him seemed impossible. My mind hung up on the idea of people like him walking around disguised as people like me. So, is there a way for you to get back to your realm? I asked after a moment of silence between us. I'm not sure. There are a lot of us in this realm, and some are better with the arcane than others. They're trying to find ways back, but there hasn't been any luck so far. Do you miss it? I asked in a hushed tone. The smile momentarily faded from his lips, and he shook his head. I've never been. Elaith and I were born here. Aside from the glamour I showed you, neither of us has really mastered the use of magic because of it. That's why we're guardians. He paused for a moment and looked at me. As if he had read my mind, he answered my next question. Trained fighters or protectors who keep the Unseelie away from the mortals. That creature in the river near my house, are there more of them? I asked, nervous to hear the answer. Honestly, I don't know, he sighed. Neither Elaith nor I know exactly what that was. It's not one we've ever seen before, but we're going to find someone who might have answers. Either way, I'd stay away from the river if I were you. Oh, I plan to, I muttered in response. So, what now? When Elaith gets back, we'll accompany you home, and you can recover there, he replied, looking away from me when he spoke. As soon as he finished speaking, he looked at me with an awkward smile. I could tell right away that he was lying. Errol. Elaith didn't want to bring her there, to begin with. There was no way I could convince her not to wipe Lottie's memory of all this. And trying to convince her that Lottie was my soulmate would be even more difficult. I'd have to devise another viable way for her to keep her memory and be allowed back in the village. When I first met her, she was severely hurt and covered in blood, so I couldn't tell how beautiful she was. But now, I could see the life in her eyes and how her face looked when she was confused. Her voice was soft, and the sun-kissed glow was back in her skin. She was stunning in every way. And I needed her to stay with me. It had been a little over an hour since Elaith left to find Lottie's dog, and I was starting to worry about her. Anything could have happened while she was out there alone. She could have run into another one of those creatures. Chapter 4. Errol. She could have fallen and hurt herself, or something much worse could have happened. "Is everything all right?" Lottie asked me after a few minutes of sitting in silence. I'd finished telling her everything I knew and stepped away to give her time to process everything. I smiled at her and shook my head. "She's been gone too long," I started to explain but cut my sentence short when I saw her running to the village through the window. Even from a long distance, I could tell something was wrong. She had the dog with her, and he was running behind her, seemingly unbothered. "Wait here," I said to Lottie before descending the ladder leading into our house and rushing to meet her. "Elaith, what is it?" "It's gone," she breathlessly told me, pointing to the woods behind her. "It's not by the camp or near the water. I don't know where it could be." "How can that be? I killed it," I mumbled to myself, thinking back over the encounter. I sighed when I realized I had never explicitly checked to see if it was dead or injured. I was in such a rush to help Lottie. The village was abuzz with the news of what happened, and people stopped walking and stared at us as we talked in the open. "We must be able to track it," I offered Elaith. I heard laughing from above us and whipped my head up to see who it was. Of course, it was Hagen and Thalon watching us from the balcony of their treehouse. I could have killed them. This was serious, and in my eyes, they were partly to blame. "Well, Thalon, I guess the Guardian's golden girl isn't perfect after all," Hagen joked before breaking out into more laughter. I shook my head and stormed up the ladder to meet them. Elaith called after me, to no avail. I gripped the collar of Hagen's shirt and pulled him close to me. Thalon stood next to me and tried to intimidate me. "If it weren't for you two nitwits snagging our supplies after we left, we could have helped the girl at the camp, and we wouldn't have had to come back here. It's your immaturity that's done this. The two of you aren't fit for the emblem." I ripped the pin off Hagen's shirt and tossed it aside. He looked down at the ground where it landed and then back at me with disgust. "You've always got an excuse for your mistakes," he spat back at me. "If it weren't for your father, you wouldn't have ever become a guardian." Hagen was probably right. There were others fitter for the role than me, folk who would have taken the entire job much more seriously than I did. I might have been nonchalant about it all, but my role brought me pride, and having someone like Hagen tell me I wasn't good enough for it angered me. I turned around and pressed him hard against the balcony railing, leaning him backward just a bit. It was an empty threat, but he didn't know that. "Don't you ever speak about my father again," I demanded in a low, intimidating voice. "Do you understand?" Hagen nodded his head. I looked behind him to see a furious Elaith yelling for me to get down there right away. I backed away, and Thalon rushed to his brother to ensure he was all right. I climbed down the ladder, fully aware that everyone was staring at me as I returned to Elaith. "What was that?" She sighed at me as we walked back to our treehouse. Instead of answering her, I responded, "We need to find Ileana and talk to her about what that thing could have been." Lottie's dog, Remy, ran up to me and jumped on my leg. I pet its head before gently pushing it off me. It walked back to Elaith and jumped on her. She looked at it and winced, shooing it away from her. "We should get him back while it's still light out, then go talk to her," she suggested. I halted at the bottom of the ladder and turned to her. It was wrong to think this, but I was glad the creature was gone because it gave me a good reason to keep Lottie here. I just needed to figure out how to tell that to Elaith. "She can't go back, not when that thing is still out there," I said. "Look, we know that some Unseelie can mark their victims. What if this one did?" Lottie was scratched. "It's too dangerous to keep her here," she retaliated in a firm voice. "There's too much for a human to know about. What does that matter if we're going to wipe her memory anyway?" I argued. That was the last thing I wanted, but I could find a way out of that one later. All I needed was for Lottie to stay here where I knew she'd be safe. If that thing is tracking her, why should we let it track her here where every one of our people are waiting to be killed by it too? It's our job to protect her from the Unseelie, and if we bring her home now, we might as well be telling all the Unseelie that we can't do our jobs anymore. The look on her face told me I had struck the right chord to convince her. She'd let her stay, and I could figure out the rest later. I picked Remy up and carefully climbed the ladder to bring him to Lottie. I knew she'd be thrilled to see he was safe and sound. As soon as I sat him down, I heard Lottie's squeal of excitement as she ran right to him. She knelt and began petting him. Excited to be in her care again, Remy began wagging his tail. Elaith climbed up too, and we gave Lottie a moment of happiness with her dog before we broke the scary news. She must have realized we were both just staring at her because she suddenly froze and looked up at us with a confused expression. "We have some bad news," I explained. "The creature is gone. It must not have been dead," Elaith quickly said. The horrified look on Lottie's face made me wish I'd have spoken sooner and broken it to her a little bit easier. But I doubt it would have changed the reaction much. "We have to do something," Lottie exclaimed, standing and quickly approaching us. "There are plenty of other innocent people out there that might stumble into it as I did. We can't let that happen. We," Elaith started to say with a particular emphasis on the word, "are going to find it and kill it. You are going to stay here where you'll be safe." Lottie stared at Elaith for a moment, then looked back at me. I sighed and looked between them. Elaith was right, there wasn't much Lottie would be able to do. She had no powers, and I doubt she was much of a swordsman. Having her involved in the search would just be a liability, but having to tell her that was a different story. "It's too big of a risk to have you there," I told her. She rolled her eyes and shook her head. "There has to be something I can do," she insisted. I looked at Elaith, and she gave me a look I immediately recognized as her having a good idea. "Actually, there is something. There's someone in the village we think might know what that creature was. You could talk to her and describe what happened and what you saw, then, she might be able to help us." "Okay," Lottie answered without hesitation. "I'll do it. I'll take you to her," I offered her. Lottie nodded at me and smiled to agree. Elaith found Lottie a change of clothes and gave it to her so she wouldn't be walking around in her tattered, bloody clothes from the night before. She changed into them and got ready to go quickly. Remy was very interested in Elaith and me. She wasn't too fond of him, but I was starting to think he was fun. When Lottie was ready, she climbed down the ladder of the treehouse. I was about to follow her down, but Elaith grabbed my arm and stopped me. I looked up at her, and she wore a serious expression. "Errol," she said in a low, flat voice, "don't get too attached to her." I nodded my head and descended the staircase. The tone of Elaith's voice told me that what she said wasn't a suggestion but a command. And I knew I wouldn't be able to obey it. The village we walked through was surprisingly discreet for its large size. Errol explained how everything worked while we walked through. The tree canopy had several houses much like his own, there were entrances into underground residences and communal spaces, and some trees had been hollowed out and preserved to act as homes for smaller creatures. Even more surprising was that over 100 Fae lived in the village. Some unsuspecting person might walk through without ever noticing creatures living there. It was all very fascinating, and even though I was walking with Errol and I had seen him use his magic, I was still waiting for the pinch that would wake me up. But the longer I spent with him, the less likely it seemed that it would happen. "Don't mind Elaith," Errol said after we walked silently for a few moments. "She means well. She's just very protective of our way of life. Many of the Fae don't really trust humans, so it might take some time for her to warm up to you." Chapter 5. Lottie. "If you don't trust us, why go through all the trouble of protecting us?" I asked him. He shrugged his shoulders, and I laughed at him. "I guess part of it is to protect the innocent people who don't know what's out here lurking in the shadows. But I honestly think the other part is to keep the Unseelie from gaining any power or control." "Both parts are very noble, though," I offered with a smile. I couldn't explain why, but spending time with Errol felt natural. It felt like I'd known him for years, and we were just taking a walk together. The night before slipped from my mind as we chatted along the way to Ileana's house. I found that I was a little disappointed when we arrived and had to stop talking. Errol knelt and wiped some dirt around on the ground. I'd have been very confused if he had not told me about the underground houses. Eventually, his fingers stopped on what I thought was a tree root growing above ground. He pulled on it, and a hatch opened up below him. It was small, but I saw a small staircase descending lower into the ground. "Amazing," I whispered to myself as I started walking down the stairs. "I guess it is pretty cool," Errol laughingly agreed. He closed the hatch and slid right by me so he could walk ahead of me. He took my hand to guide me down because it was too dark for me to see clearly. "So the Fae can see in the dark?" I asked as we climbed down. "No," he laughed. "I've just been down here a lot. I'm as blind as you are right now." We landed on solid ground after what I would guess was 3 flights of stairs, and I was thankful to see some light ahead of us at the end of a hallway. "Before we go in there, I should warn you," Errol whispered. "Ileana is one of the oldest Fae in this realm, and she's very powerful. But she's not one to trust humans at all. We were so close in the narrow hall that it felt like he was whispering in my ear. I had to replay the words over in my mind a few times to fully understand what he was saying because I was too distracted by the proximity of the whisper. "This should go well," I sarcastically chimed before we reached the end of the hall. Errol knocked on the door, and after a moment, the sounds of quick shuffling came from the other end. The door opened, and the scent of burning wood and sage wafted to me. In the doorway stood a tiny older woman. Her shoulders were hunched forward, and she squinted her eyes to look up at Errol. "What is it?" she asked after a moment. Her voice was coarse and weak, but the annoyance still rang through. "It's good to see you, Ileana," Errol goaded her. "As much as I'd love to chat, we're actually here on business." "I have no business with the Watchers," she sternly replied. "Guardians," Errol corrected her. I smiled to myself, knowing that the old Fae was clearly trying to annoy him, and it worked. "I have no business with them either." I couldn't help but laugh at that, and Ileana whipped her head up to look at me. "Especially when they bring humans into my home." She started to back away and close the door in our faces, but Errol held his hand out and held it open. He was easily 4 times her size, and she knew she was no match for his strength, so she resigned and moved aside to let us in. "Your father will be hearing about this," she mumbled to herself as she shuffled to close the door behind us. Errol rolled his eyes and took a deep breath. "Get on with it," Ileana demanded, shaking her hands in the air. "I could die any minute, so get a move on." "If only we were that lucky," Errol joked, and Ileana slapped his leg with her cane. I watched her walk away from us to a small table by the fire. Behind her back was a pair of translucent wings that were withered and atrophied. She hadn't left in quite some time from the looks of her and the rest of her home. She plopped down and crossed her arms at the table, glaring up at Errol and I. Ileana was a spitfire, and I liked that about her. "Alaith and I," Errol started saying to her. "Why didn't you send her?" "I like her," Ileana interrupted. "We encountered a creature we've never seen before, and we thought you might know what it is," he managed to finish saying. "Describe it to me," she replied. Errol turned around and looked at me. I inhaled sharply, still feeling the tenderness in my body, and prepared myself to speak. "It was bathing in the river. At first, it looked like a woman, but when it got out, it had these long arms, and it was probably 7 feet tall. It shrieked and tried to bite me. Inside of its mouth, there were 2 rows of teeth, and they were all very sharp." I rattled off all of the details I could remember as quickly as possible to avoid a rude interruption from her. "Did it bite you?" she asked me, pointing to the scar on my neck. "It scratched me," I answered, slowly raising my hand to the wound and running my fingers across it. Ileana stood from her chair and walked over to a wall completely lined with bookshelves. There were at least 100 books, some looked handbound, making me wonder if she had written them. Alongside the books were jars filled with strange things: moss, pickled eggs, butterfly chrysalises, ground-up mushrooms, and various other natural items oddly stored away. She reached up high for a book, her wings fluttering just a bit behind her, but she couldn't quite reach it. Errol walked over to the shelf, grabbed the book she was reaching for, and handed it to her. She nodded at him and rifled through the pages, looking for something. She paused when she reached the page and turned the book around for me to see it. On it was an incredibly detailed drawing of exactly what I saw. I nodded to let her know, and she sighed before turning the book back around. "I call her Yesu," she said after a moment. "There's only one like her, as far as I'm aware. She's a crossbreed Unseelie, very rare because the Unseelie hate each other almost as much as they hate everything else. Yesu is believed to be the offspring of a hag and a nixie." "I didn't think hags had children," Errol said. Ileana shook her head and walked back to the table. "It's rare, but they do. Their offspring are called changelings," she told us. "They abduct another child, usually a baby or infant too small to notice subtle differences. I'll spare you the details on what they do there. But they're replaced with the hag's changeling child and raised elsewhere. Then when they're older, they realize what they are and change. I believe Yesu is half nixie because she was a changeling to a nixie mother. The same could happen with humans and Fae." I gulped hard, and my stomach churned at the idea of it. I'd just discovered this whole new world and learned that the Fae walk among us. Now, there was the possibility that creatures like Yesu were also walking the streets. It was a lot to take in. "I shot her with my bow 5 times, and it didn't kill her," Errol told her, kneeling to be at eye level. "It'll take a lot more than 5 arrows to kill someone like Yesu," Ileana laughed in response. My head throbbed, and my stomach twisted hearing that. I stumbled backward, nearly falling to the ground due to sudden lightheadedness. The mental image of dense woods appeared at the front of my mind, and I gasped. I could feel the wind against my skin as if I were running through them. What is it? Errol asked, rushing to my side to steady me. Get out, Ileana demanded, fear heavy in her voice. Get out now. What's going on? Errol asked again, looking between me and Ileana. I see woods, I mumbled, unsure of what was happening and if it was even significant. I've seen this before. She's marked, Ileana warned us. Get her out now, before she gets us all killed. T was precisely what I feared might happen. If Lottie was marked, then there was no way I could keep her safe while Yesu was alive, and apparently, arrows wouldn't kill her. As much as I wanted to keep Lottie safe in the village, I couldn't risk the monster coming in and destroying everything else, either. Lottie would have to go home. Are you still seeing it? I asked her when we got out of Ileana's house and made it back to the surface. No, it's gone. It was brief, but I could feel things. Like I was actually in the woods. Running, she replied. That's not good, I said, offering no reassurance to her whatsoever. I started walking away, expecting her to follow me so we could quickly return to the village. When I heard no footsteps, I turned to see her standing still and staring at me. I walked back to her and gently placed an arm on her shoulder. Am I going to die? She whispered. Chapter 6. Lottie. My heart broke for her. I couldn't imagine what she was feeling, but I knew that protecting her was the most important thing to me, and I wouldn't let anything happen to her. Not while I was alive, anyway. We'll figure a way out of this, I said. It was a generic response, but I hoped it would prove to be true. She nodded and stayed close behind me as we rushed back to the village. Hagen and Thalon were lurking outside when we arrived, and I could see they were preparing to say or do something to annoy me. But I brushed right by them without paying them any mind. Once Lottie was back inside the treehouse, I started moving around, finding things I might need for the next few days away. What are you doing? Alaith asked me when she saw me frantically throwing things in a bag. I explained what Ileana said and what Lottie described, and her face went pale as she listened. I have to get her out of here. I need you to try and talk to the other guardians and get them to help look for Yesu or something. Errol, she'll just find her at her house, she argued, trying to stop me. And you'll be there with her, and she'll tear you both apart. I have to go, I said, firm in my decision. No, you don't. You'll die. I grabbed Alaith by her arm and pulled her into a room out of Lottie's earshot. I had to tell her everything so she would understand why I had to go. She's my mate, I said quickly and with 100% certainty. How can that be? Alaith asked incredulously. How can you be certain? I just know, okay. I can't explain it, but I know she is, I defended. Is that worth dying over? She whispered. I shook my head and walked out of the room to finish packing. If she wouldn't understand, I couldn't make her. I had to do what I needed to keep Lottie safe. I finished packing and told Lottie I'd meet her back outside, and she climbed down into the village. Before I could go, Alaith stopped me one last time. Please don't do this, she pleaded, her eyes teary and red. I've already lost Dad. Please don't make me lose you too. I took a deep breath and approached her. She threw her arms around my shoulders and hugged me tightly. I wished I could have reassured her and told her everything would be all right and that I'd be back in the morning. But I couldn't. I love you, I said to her when I pulled away, knowing it could have been the last time I would ever see her. She turned away from me and cried even more, her shoulders shaking with every sob. Please just talk to the others for me, I said. With that, I climbed down the ladder and started walking off into the woods with Lottie. We walked quickly, and it didn't take long to arrive at her house. Remy was sniffing at the ground the entire time and appeared to grow nervous as we got closer. Noticing that, I stepped in front of them and thoroughly inspected the area to ensure neither Yesu nor any creatures she associated with weren't there. Sadly, it seemed like Remy just remembered what happened and didn't feel safe. Lottie's door hadn't been locked, which alarmed me. But before I could say anything, she explained why it was open. I didn't lock it when I went to find Remy, she whispered before walking inside. Wait here, I advised her. Even though she said she left it open, I needed to make sure the rooms were clear of any threats before being comfortable with her entering completely. I haven't even gotten to spend one night in my house, she said with a laugh, pointing to all the boxes piled in the center of the room. Hopefully, things will be different for you tonight, so you can, I offered. So what is the plan for tonight anyway? She asked, leaning back against the counter. She looked exhausted. I couldn't imagine what she must have been feeling after everything. Honesty, I don't know. Right now, I'm just hoping that Yesu doesn't show up until I can think of something, I sighed. Lottie nodded her head and looked down at the floor before laughing. I looked at her and wrinkled my brow, confused about why she reacted like that. Are you okay? I asked her, slowly stepping closer to her. I mean, I've been better, she replied after she collected herself. I'm currently being hunted down by a river monster that looks like it could rip me in half. So I have been better. I leaned against the counter next to her and pulled my lips into a tight line. There were many things I needed to talk to her about, but it was clearly not a good time. But with everything going on, when would it be a good time? I'm sorry, she blurted out after a moment. Sulking and pitying myself isn't going to help us at all. Let me put some food in the oven, and we can try to figure something out. Lottie pulled some food out of her freezer and put it inside the oven without any other preparation. It was fast, and I doubted it would be very flavorful, but a savory smell quickly overtook the house. She pulled it out of the oven about 20 minutes later and started digging through the boxes in the kitchen, looking for something. She pulled out a round knife and cut into the food before handing me a plate. It's pizza, she explained when she saw the face I made, looking down at it. I did as she did to eat it, and I was surprised by how good it was. She calmed down as she ate. I watched her shoulders relax over the course of the meal. I wondered when the right time to tell her she was my mate would be. I didn't know much about the humans in the realm, but I knew they had different customs than the Fae. There had been stories of Fae with human mates that made their way to our village. Some of our kind look down on them for mating with mortals because they see them as inferior to us. I've never cared about mortals being weaker than us. What struck me about those stories was the horrible pain of watching your one and only true love wither away and die while you were forced to live on for hundreds of years and forget about them. Finding your mate was a beautiful thing, but a cruel punishment for them to be mortal. I needed to talk to Lottie about it. How does this tracking thing work? Lottie asked after a few minutes, pulling me away from my mind. How can I tell when she's using it? I don't know how it works, but when you had that vision at Ileana's, that was from her using it. From what I understand, she can invade your mind and see through your eyes. Which is how you could see through hers, I explained. Ooh, she whispered, stroking the bandaged wound. So she'll have to do it again to figure out where I am now. Most likely. What if I wear a blindfold or something? She suggested, her face lit up as if she'd found the missing puzzle piece and solved our problems. I can't say it wouldn't work, but do you remember how you could feel everything around her? She can too. We sat in silence for a moment, and she was obviously still thinking hard about what she could do. I decided to take this opportunity to tell her what had been on my mind. There's something important I need to tell you, I started saying. Her eyes fell on me, and I took a deep breath. When I found you and Yesu by the river, it wasn't just from hearing you. I could sense you before I showed up. I paused and looked at her. She clearly didn't understand where I was going, and I couldn't expect her to. As I was saying it, I realized how alarming that might be to her, so I stopped momentarily and tried to realign my train of thought. When we found you, I stammered for a moment. We were supposed to wipe your memory. That's what we would normally do to humans if something like this happened. But I was afraid you were marked because I didn't know what Yesu was, so I didn't want you to be at risk. So you're going to wipe my memory when this is over? She raised her voice. I gulped and looked away from her for a moment. That would be Aleith's plan, but I couldn't let it happen. There's another option, I quietly suggested. I can create a link between us, like a bond. This will allow me to take responsibility for you. If anything happens or if you do anything to harm our village, I'll be forced to deal with you. Deal with me, she clarified, crossing her arms over her chest. Kill you, Lottie. I'd be forced to kill you, I answered. She looked away from me, and the irritation on her face quickly turned to worry. But I don't want to do that. Right now, this is the only way to prevent you from having Aleith wipe your memories. This is the only way I stopped myself mid-sentence. I still wasn't ready to tell her she was my mate. The only way we can keep you safe from Yesu. I have to think about it, she whispered before walking away. I waited in the kitchen, lifting myself onto her tall counters to sit down. Half an hour later, she emerged in fresh clothes and damp hair. I watched her towel dry her hair for a moment before she sighed and looked back at me. "What would be involved with the bond?" she asked. "It's a simple ritual, wouldn't take more than 5 minutes. The only thing," I hesitated, a nervous smile creeping on my face. "I'd be able to track you and see where you are just like Yesu can." "You're kidding, right?" she asked exasperatedly. "It's a Fae thing," I shrugged. She led me into a room with a small old sofa and even more unopened boxes and gestured for me to have a seat. Lottie plopped down next to me and turned towards me, waiting for instructions. I took her hands, and my heart thudded irregularly in my chest as I touched her skin and told her to close her eyes. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, relaxing my body to feel the well of magic within myself. I wasn't the most skilled mage, but I understood it enough to figure out what to do. The glowing blue light filled our hands, and I could feel the cold kiss of it against my skin. Moments later, a small sigil appeared on the back of my hand. It was a simple line with 2 circles on either side, one filled in while the other was not. I focused my attention on the light and moved it to Lottie's hand. The light disappeared, and she saw the same sigil as mine when she opened her eyes. "We can contact each other with it. See," I stopped speaking and held my finger on the sigil. "It's that easy," I projected into her mind. "What the?" she started saying before she brought her finger to her hand to continue. "How the hell is this possible? This bond isn't something the Fae like to use, so only use it when necessary." "But won't they see the marking?" She looked down at her hand, and the sigil had vanished. She grabbed my hand and looked, mine was also gone. "Where did it go?" "The sigil was temporary, but you can still use it when you need to. If there's ever anything going on here, just let me know, and I'll be on my way." "Do I get any other powers?" she asked with an ear-to-ear grin. "No," I laughed. "This isn't a power. You should see this as a curse considering I can send you telepathic messages anytime, anywhere, forever." "That doesn't seem too bad so far," she joked. "I consider that a challenge," I replied, tapping my finger over my hand. "You're going to regret this." She laughed and tapped her hand. "You're already enjoying this too much." Rule insisted he'd be fine staying away and watching over the house during the night and suggested I get some sleep. Falling asleep was difficult. I felt a strange mixture of new house jitters, nerves about the guy waiting in my living room, and sheer terror at the possibility of being hunted down and killed in my sleep. The last part was probably the biggest reason. I had a lot of questions about everything going on, and now there was this strange bond I had with Errol that I had to figure out. Having my mind erased after all of this certainly would have been the easier option, but I didn't want to. I'd just opened my eyes to this incredible, albeit terrifying, new world. How could I choose to forget it existed? Not to mention Errol. He was different from anyone I'd ever met, and I felt a strong pull toward him that I couldn't explain. Exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. My dream was a gruesome replaying of the night by the river. Yesu's face hung over mine for what felt. Chapter 7. Lottie. Like hours on end, her teeth sharp and ready to bite into my flesh. I could hear her screech even in the dream. Suddenly I was awake and in the woods. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten there, but I was running. The moonlight barely passed through the trees, but somehow I knew exactly where I was going. I could see the tree line breaking, and I rushed toward it. Something about why I was running alerted me. I wasn't running from something, but instead, I was running to something. When I reached the edge of the tree line, I saw my house. There were no lights on inside, all the doors and windows were closed, and there were generally no signs of life. I would have believed it was a dream or even that I'd been sleepwalking had it not been for the low growl that escaped my throat. I jolted awake, sweat dripping down my forehead as I sat up in bed. Before I could do anything, I heard a loud crashing noise from outside my room. It sounded like someone had thrown something through one of the tall windows in my kitchen. The memories of Yesu were still fresh in my mind, and I knew it was her. More noises were coming from the kitchen, and it sounded like more than one person was inside. In any case, I couldn't determine how many were there through my door. My heart sank when I remembered Errol was out there. Did he have enough time to prepare for this? Was Yesu standing over him, about to devour him as she had been with me? I took a deep breath and looked around my room for anything I could use as a weapon. My adopted father had always been paranoid, so he stressed the importance of having protection in one's bedroom. I knew I had something, but I hadn't unpacked it yet. I thought momentarily, with my hand on the doorknob, ready to open it, that I could fight with my bare fists if I had to. Then I remembered where I had put my bat. I rushed to a long plastic storage tub and dumped it out in front of my bed. I dug through the clothes until I pulled out an old wooden baseball bat I had picked up at a thrift shop years ago. The door burst open before I could make it back. For a moment, I realized how lucky I was to have just decided to move, because had I not, I'd have been seriously hurt. Yesu stood in the doorway with arrows sticking out of her abdomen. She'd knocked the door right off its hinges. "Errol," I said aloud when I saw how many arrows there had been. It looked like he'd put up quite a fight against her. Before I got too bogged down with thoughts about Errol being killed, arms wrapped around Yesu's neck, and she fell forward. Errol was clinging tightly to her. I could see he had several lacerations himself, and his forehead was bleeding like he'd been hit in the head pretty badly. He pulled a dagger off his belt and prepared to stab her in the back. Another dark creature, like Yesu, only much smaller and almost human-like in appearance, walked into view. She stuck a hand out, and the dagger slipped through Errol's fingers and breezed right past my ear. It hardly made a sound rushing past me, just a brief whisper in the wind. But it lingered in my ear long after it was sunken into the old drywall. I slowly reached my hand to my ear, expecting to feel blood from a wound, but there was nothing. The shock I felt at being alive vanished as the woman grew closer. Errol was kneeling on Yesu's back and fighting to keep her down. He looked up and saw me frozen in fear. "Lottie, run," he yelled during his struggle. That alerted me. I was no longer a passenger in my own mind. My fight-or-flight reflex finally kicked in as the woman was mere inches away from me. Her face was obscured with a black shroud, but her eyes were familiar. I could have sworn I'd seen them before. But I didn't want to stick around to figure out where. I reached for my bat and, in one swift motion, swung it around and hit her head. By no means was I a strong person, but with my adrenaline pumping, I think I knocked her pretty well. She turned away and stumbled to the side, giving me a brief moment to rush past her and out of the room. Errol had subdued Yesu enough to make a run for it himself. He started heading to the back door, but I'd grabbed my car keys off the hook by the front door and swung it open. "This way," I yelled for him. He quickly skidded to a halt and turned around, passing the hallway just in time to avoid a powerful lunge from Yesu. She crashed into several moving boxes I had stacked, and I could hear virtually everything I owned being shattered and crushed under her weight. I unlocked the doors with the beeper, and to my relief, Remy heard and started running around the house from the backyard. He'd done the wise thing and escaped when Yesu and the other woman broke in. Errol was a few paces behind me, so I hopped in and swung the passenger door open. Remy jumped in first, followed by Errol. Before he had closed the door, I peeled off down the driveway. Thankfully he seemed dexterous enough to avoid tumbling out of the car when I turned. Yesu had barged through the front door and chased the car for a block. I watched in the rearview mirror as the woman walked up behind her and held her hand up to Yesu. She stopped moving shortly after and calmed down enough to turn back. Errol looked at me, his chest heaving as he leaned back in his seat. "Good job back there," he barely managed to say through his panting. "You too," I nodded, not daring to take my eyes off the road, terrified that they'd somehow get in front of us. "We should get back to the village," he said after a minute. "The harridan was there, so this is much more than we thought. We'll need reinforcements." "The what?" I asked to clarify. "Are you talking about that woman?" He started redirecting me around the woods to a place where we could park my car and quickly walk to a guardian's supply area. After that, we could safely make it back to his treehouse. "She's a hag, one of the oldest and most powerful on Earth," he finally explained. "One could assume that she is Yesu's mother considering we just saw them together." "So if Yesu's mother is the harridan, then," I trailed off, not knowing what to ask, but it seemed like Errol understood. "We're screwed," he laughed, shaking his head and looking out the window. I understood his frustration and anger, but there was something more to his response that made me wonder if he hadn't been telling me everything. He was brooding like this was something personal. "Are you hurt?" I asked him to change the subject. He reached his fingers to his forehead, where there was a large gash, then inspected his chest, where his shirt had been torn in several places. "It seems I am," he sighed, leaning his head back. I looked over, and through his tattered shirt, I saw wounds on his abdomen. They looked like scratches similar to the one Yesu gave me. "You're marked." "Maybe, we can't be sure yet. The Unseelie can't mark everyone they attack, so to use me and see where I am, then you wouldn't be marked anymore. Suddenly, the air around me felt cold. As if someone had rolled down one of the car windows and let the night air in, but no one did. My vision faded, and I was standing by the river, only this time, I knew I was seeing through Yesu's eyes. The harridan stood before me, slowly approaching and mumbling something under her breath. "Come back to me now, child," she whispered coldly, piercing my mind like a dagger. "It's tea." Before she could finish speaking, I was jolted back into my own mind. My head was tossed back against the headrest of my car, and I could feel blood falling from my nose. The loud crunch of metal filled my ears as I realized my car had been tumbling and I was upside down. Never driven in a vehicle before, and honestly, I never wanted to again. It was something I once thought would be fun. I'd seen humans riding fast through the winding roads that cut through the woods. It looked exhilarating. I don't know for sure, but I think Yesu invaded Lottie's mind. If she did, it was the worst possible moment to have done so because Lottie veered off the road, and the vehicle flipped over the side and landed in a ditch. Lottie was trapped inside, and I was desperate to get her out. The white balloon burst through the wheel during the initial hit, forcing her tightly against the seat. It slowly deflated and gave me room to wriggle her free. Making sure she was okay was my top priority. I had to get her back to the treehouse, and no matter how much Ileana didn't want to leave her hut, she'd have to come and help. I finally managed to free Lottie, and I cradled her in my arms. She was alive but unconscious. Her eyes fluttered as if she was trying to wake up but couldn't. My heart stung, knowing she was probably in pain. Chapter 8. Errol. "I'm going to make sure you're all right," I whispered to her as I carried her deeper into the woods. "Everything will be all right." Remy was in the car, and aside from a slight limp in his front leg, he seemed to get out of it pretty easily. He ran ahead as if leading me somewhere, occasionally turning around to ensure I followed him. I wasn't, but he somehow seemed to be going in the right direction. The village was close, and Remy darted away, barking as he crossed the line where it officially began. Dogs running freely and barking in the village were rare, so a few folks stepped out of their homes and looked at him. I saw Fallon step out of his treehouse and onto the balcony in the distance. He looked at Remy and then back to where he came from, spotting me as I ran with Lottie in my arms. Thankfully he rushed down the ladder and ran toward me. Hagen saw his brother running and followed behind. "Go get Ileana," I yelled to Hagen, and he nodded before taking off deeper into the village. "What happened?" Fallon asked when he reached me, offering a hand to help steady Lottie's head as we made it to the base of my treehouse. "The harridan," I breathlessly managed to say. Before I could explain more, a Lath gasped from above me. "Let me carry her up," Fallon offered, seeing how exhausted and injured I was. "No," I said, climbing up the ladder with her in my arms. "I've got her. She was my mate, and I wouldn't let Fallon touch her. He was a guardian, but I didn't trust that he'd be careful with her. If he dropped her and injured her more, I'd never forgive myself for letting it happen." But even though I refused his help, he stood below the ladder, ready to catch me or Lottie should either of us fall. It was a small gesture, but I found myself appreciating it. I got her up and laid her in my bed so she could rest comfortably. Fallon made his way up, and I watched him and Elaith whisper to one another, looking back at Lottie and me. My head was pounding. Knowing I was finally safe enough to relax, I finally felt the stinging from the wounds on my chest. I ripped open my shirt to get a better look at it. It wasn't just a scratch from Yesu, but there was a bite. Elaith and Fallon saw it, and both stared at me with their jaws dropped. Yesu had a large mouth with 2 rows of dagger-sharp teeth. It must have been a sight. They slowly approached me, their lips moving, but I couldn't hear what they said. I laughed and looked at the wound again. The skin around it had slowly faded from a bright red to a dark purple. I was really hoping she wasn't venomous, I slurred as my vision faded, and I slumped down on the floor. Early morning rays of sun flooded my eyes when I hazily opened them. I didn't know how long I was asleep, but I wished to close my eyes again and stay in bed. My brain moved slowly as it reminded me of everything that had happened. Yesu, the harridan, Lottie. When all the pieces came together, and the crash was at the front of my mind, I jolted out of bed. My entire chest burned when I moved, but I did my best to ignore it so that I could make my way to Lottie. I wasn't in my room, but a quick glance around told me I was in Elaith's. Lottie was likely still in my bed, recovering. I just hope the damage from the crash wasn't bad. I made my way to the common area of the treehouse and saw Elaith sitting at the dining room table with a cup of tea across from Fallon and Ileana. They all turned to look at me as I staggered out of the room. Elaith slowly stood up and walked over to help me, wrapping an arm around my waist to steady me. She started leading me to the table, but I shook my head and started walking on my own to my room. She needs her rest, Ileana said before I could reach the door. She's fine. Let her sleep. I hesitated momentarily, wanting nothing more than to hold her in my arms and make sure she was okay. But I walked back to the table, heeding Ileana's suggestion. If rest was what she needed, I'd give it to her. We have a lot to talk about anyway, Fallon groaned at me. I hated that he was there. Of all people involved in this, why him? He and his brother were guardians, so they'd have to be involved, but I wouldn't say I liked it. I made my way to the table and sat beside Elaith with a sigh. My entire body was sore from the fight, and my head ached, though that was only a dull pain. Tell us what happened, Elaith calmly whispered. Lottie was asleep in her room, and I was on the couch standing guard. Yesu burst through the door, and I rushed to attack her. I took a deep breath as I recalled the details. The bite on my chest stung from the memory. I must have shot her with 15 arrows. But even though I was attacking her, she was ignoring me to try to get to Lottie. I thought you said the Harridan was there. Fallon interrupted. I was getting to that, I replied, tossing a glare his way. I was about to stab Yesu, and she came up behind me and pulled the dagger out of my hand with some sort of magic. She walked right past me and approached Lottie. I smiled when I thought about what happened next. For someone who had never been in a fight, Lottie was impressive with the bat. Then Lottie hit her on the head with a bat and ran. What does she want with Lottie? Elaith asked when I finished talking. I shrugged my shoulders. If the Harridan is going to be coming here because of her, she can't stay here, Fallon demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. Where do you suppose she goes? Ileana asked before I could. I was surprised by how defensive she sounded. Of all people to defend a human, she would be the last I'd expect. Doesn't matter to me so long as she's far away from here, he replied. Elaith looked at me and then down at her hands wrapped around her mug. I knew her sentiments matched Fallon's, but Lottie being my mate no doubt complicated matters for her. We have a duty to protect her, she said in a quiet, unconvincing voice. And we should risk a certain death for the entire village for her. Fallon protested. Don't be foolish, Ileana scoffed at him. Many would die, but it would not be the entire village. I looked at her and tilted my head. In her own very strange way, she was trying to help. Ever the pragmatist, I whispered to her under my breath. If we can't agree, we'll have to take this to Ælfric, Elaith suggested. Fallon and I looked at one another, both hesitant about the idea and hoping the other would concede. He sighed and looked away from me, and I knew I'd won. Very well, he reluctantly said. But if things go awry, it's your fault. Ælfric was the fifth guardian and one of the group's founding members. He was older than Ileana and served as a sort of council over the village. Ælfric was stubborn and his word was regarded as law in our community. Though he didn't do much these days in his old age, he didn't welcome our company. And seeing him always left a sour taste in my mouth. He was my father's partner. He watched him drown and did nothing to help him. I didn't hate him, of course. I understood he'd have been killed if he had tried to help. But he pitied Elaith and me for what happened. We were young, and losing our father was hard, but we pushed through the pain. I just couldn't stomach how he treated us like wounded animals whenever he saw us. So I was relieved we wouldn't have to see him. Fallon stormed away from the table and left the treehouse. Elaith walked away from the table to refill her tea, leaving just Ileana and me alone. I wanted to thank her for being on my side, but I knew she wouldn't accept it or find a way to argue against it. You should take the human to Laurel, she suggested before slowly rising from her chair and disappearing behind the height of the table. Rule gently shook me awake. When I looked up at him covered in bandages, my heart sank. I quickly sat up to make sure he was okay after the crash, and as I did, it felt like my brain was jostling around in my skull. I groaned in pain and pressed my fingers to my temples. Take it easy, he whispered, softly holding his hands against my arms. There's a lot to catch you up on, but we have to go somewhere to get some more information. He helped me stand up, led me to a tall table, and told me to sit down. He dug through some cabinets and dumped several different herbs into a pot of boiling water. A few minutes later, he brought me a cup of tea. I sniffed it, and it smelled strongly like licorice. I set it down. It's not very good, but you need to drink it, Errol laughed. It'll take away a lot of the pain. He sat across from me with a calm smile. I stared into his eyes for a moment and could feel myself relaxing. They were calm and warm, and... Chapter 9. Lottie. Looking into them felt like a reassuring hug. I nodded my head and took a sip of the tea. He was right, it was disgusting. Delicious, I groaned sarcastically after nearly gagging on the bitter tea. Where is it you're taking me? We need to know why the Harridan is so concerned about you, and there's someone who we think might know, he explained. Their name is Laurel. It will be quite shocking to see them, but they're exceptionally wise, and they'll know something. Why will it be shocking? I nervously asked. They were among the first to settle in the mortal realm, even before the portals were shut off and our kind were stuck here. They've been here for hundreds of years. Why did they stay here so long? I asked. From what Errol had said, it seemed like all of the Fae wanted to return to their own realm. They had a human mate. Like a lover, I clarified, and he nodded his head. She died, and Laurel was cursed to live on forever. They wanted to stay close to her, so they spent a lot of time where her body was buried. The legends of what happened get a little blurry, but Laurel didn't leave the spot. Over time, nature took over and formed around them, and somehow, it kept them alive. I stared at him, confused about what he meant. I imagined someone covered in vines and brush, withered and atrophied. On top of that, the story itself was heartbreaking. I couldn't imagine what it would feel like to love someone so much as they did. They're difficult to spot, but I'll point them out to you when we get there, he said after a moment. I'd finished my gross tea while he talked, and somehow I felt much better. My headache had substantially subsided, though I still had some aches and pains here and there. I was doing much better than I had been just minutes before. Errol led me down the ladder to begin our hike through the hazel woods. I was nervous that Yesu would invade my mind again on the way. I hadn't dreamt after the crash, so I hoped they didn't know where I was. We walked for about 30 minutes with Remy trailing behind us, sniffing the ground happily as he explored. Errol stopped me as we approached a tree much larger than any of the others surrounding it. He looked over the base and cautiously walked around it. After a moment, he called me over, and I saw what he was talking about. At first glance, the tree seemed normal except for a large protrusion in the bark. The more I stared at it, the more detail I noticed in the tree. There was a silhouette of a person sitting down and leaning against the tree's base. Two large roots sticking out of the ground seemed to be the legs. Their arms were crossed and rested calmly in their lap. A small, sharp face was barely visible until Errol spoke. Laurel, he whispered, and a pair of yellow eyes appeared at the tree's base. It's Errol, one of the guardians. I know who you are and why you are here, a dry, raspy voice croaked out. I watched the mouth move in awe. Their head didn't turn, but their eyes slowly rose, and looked up at me and then back at Errol. Such a sorrow to live a curse the same as me, they croaked. I wrinkled my eyebrows, not understanding what they meant. Errol cleared his throat and looked back at Laurel. This is Lottie, he said, pointing to me. She was marked. Lottie is not your true name, Lauren interrupted, looking right at me. My full name is Charlotte, I slowly replied, unsure what they meant. Talia, Laurel croaked before looking away from me. As the name escaped their dry throat, something surged through me. For a moment, I thought Yesu was about to invade my mind again, but it was something else entirely. My breath quickened, and panic set in as I watched Errol back away from me, watching me in horror. He said something, but I didn't hear it. He looked at Laurel, but they'd closed their eyes and stopped answering him. Something inside of me was shifting, and I couldn't find a way to stop it. Every hair on my body rose, and it felt like I'd been struck by lightning. A blast of cold rose in my body, so cold it felt like I was on fire. I cried out in pain as every nerve in my body was ignited at once. The ground came crashing into me, and I watched the fresh green grass wither and dry out before turning to ash under my touch. What's happening to me? I begged for an answer. Errol was watching me with a pained expression. I could see how he wanted to reach out and help me but couldn't get close. I didn't want him to, either. Small beams of light zapped from my fingers uncontrollably. It was like I could see every atom and molecule around me and manipulate them. A tear fell from my eyes onto the ground, and smoke rose as it singed the earth. A voice took over my mind. It whispered unintelligible things, and I felt the panic subside. Calmness overtook my body, and I climbed to my feet. Errol calmly approached me, and I watched as my hand raised and a ball of smoldering fire formed. I smiled and threw it in his direction. Watched Lottie change in complete shock. Her honey-colored hair turned silver, and her skin changed into a sickly gray. She wasn't Lottie, though. She was Talia. I'd nearly fallen to my knees when Laurel said the name. We'd all heard about Talia, but she was a legend, not someone we ever thought would have a chance of living. And she was my mate. The second Lottie Talia stood up, I could feel the connection we had grow stronger. It pulsated throughout my body. When I first saw Lottie, I knew she was my mate, and I could feel the connection. I wondered why it wasn't as all-consuming as others described, but I had chalked that up to hyperbolic storytelling. But when Talia stood up and looked at me, I could have collapsed to my knees, it was so strong. And yet she attacked me. I narrowly avoided her spell and ran through the woods as fast as I could, still in disbelief over what had just happened. I looked back periodically to see if she was following me, but she didn't appear to be. When I returned to Chapter 10. Errol. The village, I yelled for all of the guardians to meet me, which I knew alarmed all the other folk. Elaith was still inside the treehouse with Ileana and, to my surprise, Alfric. Fallon and Hagen ran up moments after I arrived, and I looked between all of them, exhausted and breathless. Talia is here, I informed them. They were all shocked, and I knew it would be much worse when I told them the rest. Lottie is Talia. Elaith had a system when she was angry. First, she'd yell and berate you, let you know how bad you messed up. Then she'd give you the silent treatment for a while to let what she said sink in. That was her normal. Her reaction to what I'd told her wasn't normal. She sat across from me with the most placid, blank expression I'd ever seen on her face and stared at me. I was waiting for the explosion, but it never came. If she'd yelled at me and called me a fool, it would have at least broken the defeated silence hanging in the room. No one spoke. Fallon didn't even take the opportunity to say I told you so. However, the quiet resolve in the room spoke volumes. There was nothing we could do now. We all knew the prophecy. We knew who Talia was and what havoc she could sow upon the world. After all, it was her entire purpose. There has to be something I can do, I whispered after what felt like an eternity. You've done enough, Hagen scoffed. Normally, I'd have leaped across the table and made him eat his words. But he was right. Had I followed Elaith's orders when all of this began, we would have wiped Lottie's memory, then she would have gone home. Yesu would have attacked and killed her, and everything would be as it was. But we gave the Harridan time to realize who she was after Yesu attacked her. We opened the door for this. There's no point blaming Errol, Ileana chimed in. I still didn't understand why she was defending me. Hagen, take me to my hut, I might have some books that can help us. Hagen nodded his head and carried Ileana out of the treehouse. She could walk, but it was quite the distance to her hut, and flying wasn't an option. When they left, Fallon looked at me and sighed. She's right, I doubt there's much that could have been done differently, he said. I was even more shocked that he wasn't coming down on me. Elaith refused to meet my eyes, and I knew she blamed me somehow, which hurt more than anything. Alfric, Fallon began, what do you know of this prophecy? The older man cleared his throat and paused momentarily, reaching into the depths of his mind for the answer. Talia is the changeling child of a powerful Fae and the Harridan. She's hundreds of years old and more powerful than anyone in this realm, and most of the Fae realm, for that matter, he explained. Why was she disguised as Lottie? And why didn't she know who she was? I asked. I don't know, Alfric shrugged. If anyone can figure that out, it's Ileana. He turned away from him, and we all sat again in silence. There had to be a way to make this right again. I dug deep into my mind, trying to think of everything my father had taught us in lessons. Elaith had been the one who paid attention to history and stories. I was more focused on learning to fight. Apparently, Elaith had been doing the same thing because she perked up after a few minutes. I could see in her eyes that something had clicked, some brilliant idea had come. What is it? I eagerly asked her. Her powers, she whispered, and I leaned closer to pay attention. She has to get 'em from somewhere. Assuming her Fae parent isn't in this realm, then her only source would be the Harridan. Is that how that works? Fallon interjected, as confused as I was. Neither of you ever paid attention, did you? She sighed. Yes, our powers and magic are directly connected to our realm. That's why the three of us aren't able to use it like her. We were born here, and our parents are gone. So if the harridan is gone, she loses her powers. I clarified. Maybe, I don't know, she quickly replied with a nervous look in her eyes. She's the most powerful creature in the area, how would we even go about that? Fallon asked. Just then, Hagen climbed up the ladder with Ileana on his back. Clutched in her small hands was an old tome. Hagen set her down, and she made her way over to us as quickly as possible, climbing onto one of the chairs and slapping the book down. She opened it to a page inside where a hag was illustrated with minuscule notes written in the margins. She pulled a chain out from under her collar and produced a magnifying glass. The hag is a vile creature whose only pleasure in this world is chaos. We know that. Incredibly strong and capable of using powerful dark magic. She mumbled to herself as she searched through the words. Here it is, hags don't believe in much other than chaos, however, the prophecy regarding the Unseelie Queen is regarded as true amongst them all. The Unseelie Queen would be the offspring of an arch-fae and Unseelie. According to the prophecy, the Queen shall be crowned after she kills her mother and absorbs her powers. Once crowned, they will shroud the realm in darkness and... She trailed off before she finished reading the incredibly bleak ending of the description. So there's nothing we can do, really, I said after a moment. I thought it was quite clear, Ileana replied. Talia has to kill the harridan. When she kills her, she becomes all-powerful. But if we kill her, then there will be no Unseelie Queen, I finished. This all sounds amazing, but I'll ask this again, Fallon said, how are we supposed to kill the harridan? Not to mention Yesu, Alaith chimed in. You said yourself arrows don't do anything against her. I'm sure there will be more than just Yesu, too, Fallon replied, nodding at Alaith. The harridan isn't strong, Alfric interjected for the first time. Your father and I fought her before. He smiled to himself as he recalled the memory. What did you do? I asked him. Getting close enough to her to fight her will be your biggest issue. She's powerful with magic, but her body is frail. Swarm her, and make sure she can't focus on just one person. If she's overwhelmed, someone can get close enough to kill her. Why didn't you kill her? Alaith asked. Your father thought we could live peacefully, he sighed. That seemed like something my father would do. Chase down a monster just to let it go under the promise that it would behave. Yesu is likely tied to her mother, Ileana added. When the harridan is hurt, she'll be hurt too. We all knew we'd have to act fast. If Lottie made it to the harridan and killed her before we did, then the world as we knew it would end. Fallon and Hagen ran to their treehouse and prepared for battle. I grabbed oak off the wall and a quiver stuffed with arrows, strapping 2 swords to my side as well. I wasn't as good with a sword as Alaith, who had a broad sword strapped behind her back, but if I got close enough to the harridan, I was confident I could finish this. Alfric stayed behind, he was too out of practice to be much use in a fight. But Ileana insisted on coming with us. I asked her to stay behind, but she refused dozens of times by telling me she couldn't trust me to ensure everything was finished. Honestly, I was pretty interested to see what she could do to help us. I wouldn't be surprised if she had some strange magic to help us. When we were all ready, we met at the front of the town. Alfric was advising the other villagers to lock themselves safely inside until told otherwise. There was a panicked buzz throughout the town, and I hoped we would come back and be able to tell them it was all okay. I closed my eyes and pressed 2 fingers to the back of my hand to try and locate Lottie. Thankfully, our bond was still up, and I was able to. She's by the river, I said to the rest of the group. I could see Talia kneeling on the ground and looking at a set of tracks to follow them. She's tracking them. We need to move. The 5 of us raced through the woods to the river. I could easily see Yesu's tracks in the dirt, and we followed behind them. We periodically stopped so I could try to make sure we were on the right path. We closed in on her as she entered a small clearing with a ramshackle old cabin covered by vines with broken windows and a caved-in roof. She led us right to the harridan's house, and she was walking inside to take her crown. The inside of the cabin was dark and moist. It had rained, and the holes in the ceiling did nothing to protect the interior of the dilapidated old house. It looked like it should have been condemned years ago, and it might have been, but the harridan had made it her home. The walls were crawling with intrusive vines pushing through the windows to reclaim this land as their own. I waited in the center of the room for her. She'd been calling to me, trying to bring me home. Every moment I waited, more memories flooded back. I'd been locked away in a box within my mind for 10 years. Sent to live with humans and forced to integrate into their world with fake memories to disguise the fact that I wasn't just some meek girl. I was glad to be free again, but I needed to know why she did it. Those 10 years had been torture, and I needed to understand why my own mother would lock me away like that. She walked through a door in the back of the cabin. After a few moments, Yesu was behind her, hunched over and snarling with her long black hair. Chapter 11. Talia. Hanging in front of her face. Even though many of my features changed, I still had the scar. I was actually quite fond of Lottie's small town, girl next door charm. But I welcomed my own features as they came back to me. Talia, my mother greeted me with a sinister smile. You made it. You wanted to see me, I calmly replied, holding my tongue to avoid lashing out. I'd been looking for you for so long. After we disguised you, is that what you're calling it? I interrupted, my tone much sharper than I intended. I see you still don't agree with my decision, she sighed. If I hadn't done that, the Guardians would have killed you when they found out what you were. I couldn't have that. What changed then? I asked, not believing a word. I have so much to tell you, she said, gesturing for me to follow her. Tell me here. I'm not going anywhere with you, I demanded. She sighed and nodded her head. You're so much more than just an Unseelie. The door burst open, and 4 elves burst in with weapons drawn. I backed up and readied a ball of fire in my hands. I recognized Errol in the back with his bow drawn. For a moment, I considered lowering my hands and letting him win. He was my mate, I'd know it as Lottie, but I was just a passenger then and couldn't say anything. Elaith rushed at me with her sword while I considered what I would do and knocked me down. I was shocked that Errol hadn't tried to stop her, and a pang of hurt filled my chest. I screamed, and a surge of power radiated from my body, forcing Elaith back into the air about 10 feet. She landed on the floor, and thankfully her sword flew away, which gave me a moment to recover. I stood up and glared at her, 2 more bolts of power running through my fingers, and tossed them right at her. Unfortunately for me, but good for her, I missed it. It had been quite some time since I used my powers, and I was a bit rusty. She stared at me in shock and scrambled backward to get her sword. She stood up and faced me again. I screamed again, and another pulse of force shot from my body, knocking her back again. As she was on the floor backing up, I laughed at her. From behind me, completely surprising me, I was hit with a sword. When I turned around, Thalon was brandishing his weapon at me and preparing to strike again. I lowered my head at him and held my hand up as if I were making a marionette puppet dance and whispered something under my breath. His eyes went wide for a moment, then, there was nothing behind them at all. I turned back to Elaith and moved my fingers around to direct Thalon toward her. He lifted his sword and swung it at her. She narrowly avoided it, but I made him swing again. She looked back at me, not knowing if she should attack her fellow guardian or continue with me. Before I could engage with her more, Errol stepped in front of her. He had his bow in his hand with an arrow tightly strung. You don't want to do that, I whispered. You couldn't hurt your mate, could you? He wavered for a moment but raised his bow at me. If it means saving the world, I could. He let the arrow fly, and it hit me. I stared at him in genuine shock as I collapsed on the ground. His eyes were filled with tears as he watched me fall. I cried out in pain sometime later. A sudden, excruciating pain filled my body. It was so unbearable that I wished I'd died. My eyes burst open, and I looked around to see what was causing it. While I was on the ground, the fight had ended, and Errol was standing behind my mother, pulling a bloody sword out of her back. Lottie screamed. I knew I'd done something horrible. It sounded like I'd killed her. I intended to keep her alive so I could find some way to work around her being an evil Unseelie so we could be together. I tossed my sword aside and rushed over to her. She was whimpering in pain, and I didn't know what to do to help. She lifted her hand to my face as she panted heavily. Small surges of power ran through her fingers, but they slowly dissipated. She tried whispering something to me, but her voice was too soft to hear. Errol, what are you doing? Thalon yelled at me, urging me to get away from her. Elaith pushed him out of the cabin and followed the others out, sparing one last glance back at me before she did. I knelt closer to Lottie and held her hand in my own. I didn't know what to say to her. She knew she was my mate, she told me during the battle, and Chapter 12. Errol. In return, I shot her. I desperately wanted to save her, to ensure she would be okay, but I didn't think I could. Lottie, I'm so sorry, I whispered, brushing her silver blonde hair from her face. She tried to say something back to me, but no words could pass her lips. Every nerve in my body was on edge, and all I could think to do was scream, but I needed to keep it together, at least for a few minutes, for Lottie. I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned around. Elaith was standing at the door watching me with a somber expression. What can I do? I called to her, begging her to think of something to save my mate. She opened her mouth and shrugged, looking desperately around the room for any clue. I'm sorry, she choked. Ileana walked through one of the other rooms in the cabin with another book tightly gripped in her hands. This one was much smaller and bound in leather. I think I can trap her again, she muttered as she kneeled. This is the Harridan's book, and she said that was how she'd hidden her away. I looked down at Lottie to see if she would want that or not. She nodded her head and squeezed my hand. Do it, I said, backing away from her and giving Ileana space to work. She gave me a list of items to gather from around the cabin, and I got them. I sat back against one of the walls gripping my twin's hand as we watched Ileana work. For all the protesting I did about her coming, I was now glad she was here. After about 15 minutes, she finished reading whatever passage in the Harridan's book she was reading and called me over. I jumped to my feet and ran to them. How is this possible? I said as I watched Lottie's face shift back to the one I'd seen when I first met her. Her hair was the same honey blonde, and her skin returned to her usual olive color. I don't fully know, she admitted. It was just a hunch. Ileana stood up and walked out of the cabin to give us a moment alone. Lottie's eyes opened, and I'd never felt so relieved in my life. What happened? She groggily asked me, sitting up and rubbing her temples. What do you last remember? I asked her, not sure where to begin telling her this story. We were talking to Laurel, she answered, looking around the cabin at the aftermath of the fight. Is that? Yesu, I finished for her, then nodded my head. She's gone now, and so is the Harridan. I don't remember any of it, she sighed. I stood up and helped her to her feet, not taking my hand away from hers while we stood together. I reached my other hand to her face and held it there for a moment. She leaned into the palm of my hand and smiled at me. I thought I lost you, I whispered to her. Lottie's eyes fell between my eyes and lips, then darted nervously around the room. I could tell she didn't know what to say, but she didn't need to say anything. I leaned down slowly and pressed my lips against hers. We both froze briefly, partially in shock about the kiss, but she lifted her hands around my neck and kissed me back. We walked back to the village together, holding hands. When we got there, we saw Remy running freely in the center of town. He ran up to us and jumped on Lottie, licking her in greeting. I watched her greet him with a smile before carrying him up the ladder to the treehouse. Lottie sat in my bed, prepared to doze off after everything. She was undoubtedly exhausted from the near-death experience she didn't remember having. Before I let you sleep, I started, reaching for her hand. What happened back there made me realize I shouldn't hold my feelings back. Remember when I was talking about mates? Yeah, she nodded, taking my hand and squeezing it. Well, when I found you by the river, I knew right away that you were mine. She blushed and looked at me with a confused expression. I know it's a lot to take in, but I just needed to tell you. So what does that mean? She asked me. I have a connection to you stronger than any other I've ever felt. And I love you, Lottie. I have since I first laid eyes on you, I whispered. It's strange, she replied, blinking a few times before looking back at me. But I've felt the same way. She squeezed my hand, and I leaned in to kiss her again. This time, I could feel a spark between us that told me I was right. I'd almost lost her, and I would do everything in my power to make sure that never happened again.